So the next three videos are going to be reasonably short, I hope. I'm going to walk you guys through some explanations for racial and ethnic inequality. These are also summarized in Chapter 3, so if you're looking for a place to sort of get some additional information and some elaboration on some of this stuff, um, by all means, have a look at the chapter. I am also going to make reference to a book that was published in 1994 called The Bell Curve by social scientists Herrnstein and Murray. There is a response to the arguments of the book by a biologist by the name of Stephen Gould. The response is covered under a reading called Curveball. I'm not sure if I've placed it in the readings of interest folder or if I've placed it in the course readings folder, but I strongly encourage you guys to take a look at that and see how a biologist responds to the gross misrepresentations of IQ and a genetic component to intelligence that Herrnstein and Murray represent in their book. So there's some additional material out there that I would encourage you guys to check out. Okay, so the first set of theories about racial and ethnic inequality are what we call deficiency theories. Deficiency theories are explanations that look at the secondary status of subordinated groups as a result of the behaviors and the cultural traits of the subordinated groups. So, in essence, the reason why these groups are in a subordinate position is they share certain characteristics or tendencies and trends or cultural patterns that sort of serve to organize them into these subordinated positions. These are very popular theories, but it is also important to note that they have the weakest empirical support. And you're going to see a very interesting correlation that as the strength of the theory grows in terms of its validity and its reliability, it becomes more complicated but less popular. So people tend to like simple theories, especially when we're trying to explain something like racial or ethnic inequality, are often going to be inaccurate because it isn't a simple problem. So a simple explanation is probably not likely to satisfy. The empirical weakness of deficiency theories stems from problems in measurement. So, right, some of the elements that are part of these theories are measured very imprecisely, either because people have not bothered to try to measure them precisely, or because their nature indicates or dictates that there is no other way to measure these, right? That they are imprecise measures because they're imprecise concepts. So it could be that the problem is one of imprecise measurement, or it could be a poorly operationalized concept. So one of the things we'll see when we talk about intelligence is the way in which it's really hard to take that concept and turn it into something that can be analyzed from an empirical standpoint, right? That's what we call operationalization in the social sciences, is when you take your abstract concept, which is the thing that's embedded in the theory, and you turn it into something that can be tested directly through observation or measurement, which we would call an indicator or a variable. And the indicators or variables would show up in the hypothesis in a way that reflected the relationship between the concepts as those appeared in the theory. Right? So when we talk about operationalization, we're talking about a process where we take something that is abstract and try to turn it into something that's concrete. And if you do that poorly, then the thing that you're going to be measuring is not going to reflect the thing that you actually want to understand. Right? We use a measurement of an indicator or a variable to test a relationship that exists at a conceptual level in theory. The other reason, of course, why these are particularly empirically weak is that they're just not valid theories. They're not very good theories. There's a lot of different there are a lot of different things to take into consideration when assessing whether or not a theory is a good theory or a bad theory. Generally speaking, theories have to generate testable predictions, right? So that's the first criteria. If a theory is going to be good, it has to generate predictions that can be tested. And then, of course, the second part of that is that when we test them, they actually have to be supported by the data. Now, that isn't a guarantee that your theory is correct, but if either of those two things fail to obtain, then definitionally your theory is not a good theory. So one of the problems with some of these theories is that they either don't generate testable predictions, they explain things sort of after the fact by pointing to correlations, or they just don't lend themselves to the kind of measurement or the kind of empirical support that the people who generate these theories assume they're going to find. The popularity, on the other hand, is really, really easy to understand, right? The popularity reflects a couple of different things. One, a tendency or pattern in attribution that is prominent, for example, in the United States, in which we tend to explain other people's shortcomings and failures and secondary status by pointing to qualities about those individuals. It's an inversion of what we do when we tend to look at ourselves. When we look at ourselves, we engage in the United States, we engage in a pattern of attribution in which we take responsibility for the good things that happen and we externalize the cause of the things that are not positive. It's a term that psychologists call the locus of control. So where does the control rest? When it comes to things that are positive, we want to internalize that locus of control. We want to say, I got a good grade on this test because I'm smart and I studied hard. If we get a poor grade on a test, we want to externalize the locus of control. Those questions were really hard. The test wasn't fair. The teacher didn't tell us to prepare for these things, right? So in other words, we're going to shift the explanation. We're going to attribute our failure to some external cause. We are going to attribute our successes to an internal cause. So that's the pattern of attribution that tends to happen in American culture, specifically the United States, but it's also broadly speaking true of a lot of other Western societies. When we look at other people, though, we flip that, right? We do the exact opposite. We tend to externalize the explanations for their successes, and we internalize the explanations for their failures. So when we're looking at the out-group, when we're looking at the people who are not like us, we invert that pattern of attribution, and we do this so frequently that for a long time the psychologists called this the fundamental attribution error. Now we know that it's a culturally specific thing. It's not nearly as universal as psychology assumed when people started initially doing research into this, in part because, again, psychology's major problem when it comes to replicating the results of their research is that their theorizing and initial research is often conducted on non-representative samples. We look at undergraduate college students in psychology classes, and then the assumption is that the cognitive patterns or the attribution patterns or the behavioral patterns of this particular subset of the population is somehow representative of the larger population of human beings. And of course that's not true, and we find that out as psychology goes out into the broader world and tries to replicate its findings and discovers that they really can't replicate them outside of undergraduate psych classes. So I'm oversimplifying that a little bit, but there is a real problem when we sort of make assumptions about what we find to be true of a particular group of people, and the degree to which we generalize that. We got to be very, very careful. So, but nevertheless, in the United States, we do see this pattern of attribution, and a a theory of inequality that points to qualities shared by the people experiencing inequality is a handy explanation that doesn't obligate anybody else in society to try to do anything about it, right? So these people are at the bottom in part because of qualities that they possess or behaviors that they engage in or cultural tendencies that are shared within that group. This also, of course, speaks to internalized racial prejudice and racist ideologies. It strokes that sort of tendency to ethnocentrism, and it's simple, right? And at the end of the day, people really seem to like simple explanations over complicated explanations. Again, complexity is hard to deal with. So one of the things we see as a relatively common pattern in our society is the reduction of complicated things to simple explanations or simple descriptions. So the popularity of these theories stems from the fact that you don't really have to think very much about them to understand them, and thus they're very, very appealing. All right, so there are two types of deficiency theories, and I'm going to walk through both of them. The first are what we call biological deficiency theories. And there are a lot of different examples of these. I'm going to talk very quickly just about two of them. The first is kind of an initial or very early version of this, which comes out in the mid-1800s, specifically in a book published in 1857 called Progress, Its Law and Cause. This is a book written by a sociologist named Herbert Spencer, British sociologist, English sociologist. And in this book, he puts forward an idea that has come to be called social Darwinism. Well, actually, he called it social Darwinism, which is the idea that the people at the bottom of a socioeconomic ladder, the people on the lowest end of a sort of hierarchy of inequality, are there in part because they lack the capacity or the intelligence or the ability or the skill or the ambition, whatever you want to say, to move up. And as a consequence of that, Spencer argues that we as a society, shouldn't feel too terribly bad about that, and we shouldn't do very much to try to offset it. His argument is that this is in essence a kind of judgment. They have been selected against, and for society to become stronger, these weaker elements of society sort of just need to fall by the wayside, and we don't need to worry about them anymore. They're there at the bottom because that's where they deserve to be, and we can't really do anything about that because it's a function of them, not us as a society, not us as you and I in this class. So that's where we get this term social Darwinism, and this is essentially what it is. It's a biological deficiency argument for inequality. These are people who don't have the capacity to work hard. They don't have the capacity to learn to do more complicated, more socially valuable things. So we should just sort of look the other way. This is sort of at the cusp of the emergence of Victorian England, right? And if you look at the late 1800s in England, you'll see, if you've ever read Charles Dickens, you'll see in Herbert Spencer somebody who talks a lot like the character Ebenezer Scrooge, right? This guy who is just like, well, poor people, they can just die and decrease the surplus population. We'll be better off without them. That idea that is expressed by Ebenezer Scrooge in Dickens' A Christmas Carol is an embodiment of the philosophy of social Darwinism that Spencer puts out in this book, published, as I said, in 1857. And I have a very funny story to tell you about Herbert Spencer. If you remember to ask me during class, I'm happy to share it, but I won't waste our time here. But it is a very funny story. All right, so that's one of the older versions of this, and it wasn't like his was the first effort to sort of use this approach to explaining inequality, but it is fairly prominent, and I think it lingers with us to this day. So I'm going to kind of chalk that up to sort of one of the earliest examples that we have a lot of sort of ability to go back and scrutinize. A more recent version is another book that was published in 1994 called The Bell Curve. It was published by Murray Herrnstein. What is Herrnstein's first name? I can't remember. I'm sorry. drawing a blank, and Charles Murray and Herrnstein. I'll figure it out. But in this book called The Bell Curve, Herrnstein and Murray are arguing 2 points. First, mental ability is inherited. Now, for them, mental ability is measured by 2 variables called G and IQ, and you do not need to know any of the fine details of this. Just know that they really misrepresent both how these things are measured and what they mean. But they say this variable called G and this variable called IQ, which is short for intelligence quotient, those things are inherited, right? So this is biological. You inherit intelligence from your parents, and as such, there's really nothing you can do about that, right? So that's a stable kind of thing. So mental ability is inherited, and number 2, success depends on mental ability. And here they measure success as socioeconomic status, right? Kind of a classic status attainment sort of model where we look at a person's social class position. Their, again, socioeconomic status, income, wealth, occupational prestige, right? So where you fall on the sort of the economic ladder. So mental ability is inherited and success is a function of mental ability. Therefore, success is inherited, right? So some people are just biologically predisposed to being successful because they're intelligent. You can't change a person's intelligence. Therefore, there's nothing you can do to help the people who aren't intelligent. And the people who aren't intelligent are the ones who aren't successful. So there's really nothing that we can do. And so we shouldn't be, this is their argument, or one of their conclusions, is we shouldn't be spending money on things like Head Start or early childhood educational interventions, because they are not going to change your genetic predisposition toward either intelligence or a lack of it. So we should stop doing that. We should spend money on other things. And it is, not surprisingly, about as racist as it sounds. So the criticisms of the Bell Curve, and man, there were a lot of them, but it was still a very, very popular book. It sold a lot of copies. It got a significant amount of legitimacy in certain portions of the media, and not just sort of fringe media on the cultural and social right, but in like the pages of the New Republic, which was an ostensibly center left liberal magazine. Right, they did a whole series on it. Other people sort of took this argument seriously, and as a result, a lot of other people, biologists, but also social scientists, were scrambling to kind of come back and push back on this assertion. And so the criticisms of the Bell Curve kind of center around both the form of the relationship between intelligence or mental ability and success, and also the strength of that relationship, right? So one of the things that we see is that intelligence does actually change, even if intelligence is connected to success, which that is not at all established. But even if that's true, we see that intelligence, as measured, does actually change within a person's lifetime, and certainly within societies over time. So the form and the strength of the hypothesized relationship that Herrnstein and Murray kind of put out there kind of fall apart upon really close scrutiny, and that is exactly what this piece Curveball by Stephen Gould does. He'll walk you through that. So just understand that that's a response to the claim that Herrnstein and Murray are making. But again, people like this argument, right? Because it's simple, right? Hey, right? People who are successful are intelligent. And it's really easy, just not surprisingly, I suspect, it's really easy to get people who are successful to buy the argument that success is a function of intelligence, because they can point to their own success and by extension valorize or elevate their own sense of intelligence, right? So that's not a hard sell for a lot of people, to take somebody who's financially successful and say, hey, the reason you're financially successful is you're super smart, and no one's going to come back and go, oh, no, I'm an idiot, I just got lucky, right? They're going to take credit for this. So again, this idea that these theories kind of map onto our cognitive biases is not incidental, right? This is why these theories tend to stick around. There's a concept in economics, but it's kind of been sort of extended out into other social sciences, and I suspect even into the physical sciences. But a critique of what are called zombie ideas, right? Ideas that have long since been debunked, but still seem to hang around. Right, like a zombie, right? A zombie is dead, but it still keeps moving around. You really have a hard time getting rid of those things. So, so this is one of those zombie ideas, right? That we can explain the current structure of inequality by looking at the biological characteristics of the people who occupy the various layers or levels of the social class system. So that's biological deficiency. Cultural deficiency is very similar, but instead of genetic qualities or biological capacities, we're going to look at behavioral elements, right? Shared values, the norms that flow from those shared values, belief systems, even things like the structure of language and the way that the structure of language kind of encourages particular kinds of patterns of behavior. So there are a whole set of theories that kind of fall into that bucket. Again, pointing to the deficiencies of the people at the bottom of a socioeconomic status structure. But the argument is that like patterns of behavior, patterns of belief and ideology within particular communities explain the persistence of inequality as well as the position of people in the positions they occupy. A very famous example of this comes out in 1965. It's a book written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would later on go on to become a U.S. senator. This book, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, basically makes an argument that the structure of family life in the Black community constituted what he called a tangle of pathology. That was his word, a tangle of pathology, suggesting a number of interconnected tendencies and patterns that stemmed from both slavery and Jim Crow. So, for example, high rates of out-of-wedlock birth, single parenting, welfare dependency, right? All of these things were things that were perhaps well-intentioned, but essentially argues that a lack of social mobility is a function of the dysfunctional behaviors of the people who are poor. That if these people would just, make better choices, they would have better lives. It's kind of what you might call a kind of like a Ben Shapiro argument, right? Ben Shapiro, a very popular YouTuber, very famously sort of goes on college campuses. He makes lectures and guest appearances at a variety of conferences and events, and says, you can solve poverty with three basic behavioral changes, right? He says, finish high school, get a job and keep it, and wait to get married before you have children, right? And that basic argument in which he's saying that these behavioral patterns are the cause of poverty and inequality is an inversion of the actual relationship, which is that poverty structures the choices and the options that are available to people, right? So if you have to leave high school to help support your family because they're poor, did your poverty stem from the fact that you left high school, or did you have to leave high school because you were poor, right? And that's that's what always happens with these culture of poverty theses. The culture of poverty idea started with this guy named Oscar Lewis back in the 1960s. He's an anthropologist. He was an anthropologist. He's obviously not with us anymore. But Oscar Lewis studied poverty in places like San Juan and in Mexico City, and then eventually started studying poverty in New York to see what sort of patterns he could detect. And what he found was, very consistent with what anthropology tells us about how cultures form, which is that as people live in particular conditions, particular material conditions, they adopt patterns of behavior that reflect and allow them to adapt to those conditions. So a society, just a broadly structured society in which there is scarcity, is going to have a different set of cultural patterns than a society where there's an abundance of things. A society where there's an abundance of things, but those things are not equitably distributed, will be a different sort of culture than a society where there's an abundance of things that are equitably distributed, right? So there are all kinds of variability. There is all kinds of variability in material conditions. And the result of the variability in the material conditions is going to be reflected in the cultural patterns of the people who live under those material conditions as they learn to live and adapt to those circumstances. It's very much like a menu in a restaurant, right? When you go into a restaurant, you have some agency, you have some ability to choose, right? They hand you a menu and you can pick from the menu. What you can't do is pick from things that are not on the menu, right? So you might want pizza, but if you're in a Chinese restaurant, you're probably not going to find it, even if you really, really want it. Your agency, your desire to exercise a particular choice is certainly part of the equation, but the options that are available to you are also part of that equation. You might, even if you're comfortable with the food that's on the menu, if it's the day before you get paid, right, you might make a different set of choices than if it's the day after you get paid. So the way to think about the operation of poverty here is to think about it in terms of how it structures people's choices. And then, of course, they make choices, right? That's what we do. But we make choices from the list of opportunities and options that are in front of us, not from the ones that we wish we had, but the ones that we actually do. And what a lot of people who buy into this cultural deficiency theory, or these cultural deficiency theories, argue is that poverty is the cause of our choices. Our choices are the cause of poverty, but in fact what's happening is poverty is structuring our choices. And that, again, popular theories, because they absolve society overall and individual members of society who are not poor, it absolves them of any responsibility for ameliorating the conditions or even trying to change them. But again, just not very good theories. Very popular, but not very good. We'll find as we go through this rising support for the other theories as they get more complicated. I'm sorry, I said rising support. I meant rising empirical support. I want to be very precise here. You're going to see rising empirical support for these increasingly complex theories, but at the same time, you're going to see declining popularity, right? And that's, I think, not a coincidence that we have a bias towards simple but often incorrect explanations, because simple isn't always going to necessarily, cut it when it comes to something as complicated as economic inequality, even before you fold race into the equation. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about that in subsequent lectures. So until then, take care.